She was 14 years old. She was in a stranger's car, and she was already working a plan. Most people think survival is about screaming, about fighting, about raw panic turning into raw power. That's not what the research says. That's not what she did. She thought. She calculated. She manipulated her kidnapper so precisely that he pulled into a gas station, and the moment that car slowed down, she ran. I'm Danny Cruz. I spent years at the Miami Herald and Tampa Bay Times covering cases that the press reduced to headlines. This one is not a headline. This is a documented case study in survival psychology. A 14-year-old girl used every tool available to her, her voice, her calm, her intelligence, and she got out. I want to walk you through exactly what happened, the psychology she used, the research that explains why it worked, the documented patterns of abduction survival that law enforcement has studied for decades, and the systemic truth this case exposes about how children actually survive and what can be done to make sure more of them do. If you're watching this channel for the first time, subscribe. I don't do speculation here. I do documents. I do research. I do the cases that deserve more than 30 seconds on the evening news. Let's start with what the FBI knows. The FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime has spent decades studying abduction cases. They have documented one of the most important and least discussed findings in kidnapping research. The first few minutes after an abduction are the highest probability window for escape. Not after an hour, not after a day, the first minutes. Here's why that matters. In the immediate aftermath of a kidnapping, the offender is still in a state of heightened alertness. They're driving, they're monitoring, they're reactive, but they have not yet established full control. The victim has not yet been moved to a secondary location, and that matters enormously. Secondary locations dramatically increase the risk of serious harm. The research is unambiguous on that point. Every moment a victim remains close to where they were taken, close to public space, close to potential witnesses, their statistical odds of survival improve. The window closes fast. Law enforcement documentation consistently shows that offenders who successfully move victims to secondary locations have often broken the psychological resistance of those victims during transit. Not always through violence, sometimes through time, sometimes through isolation, sometimes through a documented phenomenon that researchers call frozen compliance. Frozen compliance is not cowardice. It is not weakness. It is a neurological response that predates human civilization. When the brain registers extreme threat, the kind of threat that exceeds its capacity to fight or flee in real time, it can override both of those responses and enter a state of behavioral shutdown. The body becomes still, the voice goes silent. The victim does exactly what the offender says, not out of choice, but out of neurological override. Researchers have documented this response across multiple species. It is an evolved response to predation. Play dead. Don't escalate. Don't give the predator a reason to increase force. In human abduction cases, frozen compliance can be misread by law enforcement and by prosecutors. It can look like the victim consented. It can look like the victim was calm. Neither is accurate. What's happening is that the nervous system has activated an emergency circuit that removes voluntary behavioral control. And in many documented cases, victims who enter frozen compliance early in an abduction do not recover the decision-making capacity they need to escape. The window opens, and they cannot move through it. The girl in this case did not freeze. That is the first documented fact that makes her survival remarkable. She was grabbed, she was put in a vehicle, and within minutes, before the car had traveled far, before she had been moved to a secondary location, while the window was still open, her brain was doing something extraordinary. It was scanning for options. Researchers at institutions studying victimology and crisis psychology have noted a consistent pattern among survivors who successfully escape abduction. In documented testimony, these survivors describe an almost immediate cognitive shift. Researchers call it problem-focused coping. Instead of focusing on the emotional reality of what is happening, instead of catastrophizing, instead of shutting down, the brain pivots hard toward a single question: what can I do right now? This is not automatic. It is not random. Research strongly suggests that problem-focused coping in crisis situations is at least partially connected to prior exposure to survival information. Children who have received some form of instruction about what to do in abduction scenarios, even basic information delivered years before the event, show measurably higher rates of problem-focused coping in documented crisis situations. Knowledge physically changes how the brain responds under threat. It gives the rational mind a foothold when the emotional system is trying to take over completely. She knew something. Whether it came from a school safety program, a conversation with a parent, something she read, something she watched, she had information that gave her brain a framework. She knew that the car would have to stop eventually. She knew that stopping was an opportunity. She knew that her best chance was not a fight she couldn't win inside a moving vehicle. It was a moment in public space, and she started building toward that moment immediately. This is where the documented psychology of manipulation under extreme duress becomes essential to understanding what she did. Law enforcement victim interviews in successful escape cases, specifically cases where victims escaped from moving or recently stopped vehicles, reveal a consistent behavioral pattern among survivors. Before they escaped, they managed the offender's emotional state. They spoke in measured tones. They asked questions that seemed reasonable and non-threatening. They made requests that framed the stop as a mundane necessity rather than a threat to his control. They reduced his vigilance by reducing his perception of risk. This is documented across multiple case studies. This is not purely instinct. What she did is structurally equivalent to the hostage negotiation techniques that trained law enforcement professionals use when trying to de-escalate a crisis situation. The goal in hostage negotiation is not to overpower. The goal is to create a psychological environment in which the subject makes a decision that benefits the victim. You guide them toward that decision without triggering their defenses. She did this at 14 years old, in a car, with no training and no backup. She told him she needed to use a bathroom. Accounts vary in specific wording, but the documented core of her communication strategy was consistent. She created a physiological necessity, something urgent enough to justify a stop, something ordinary enough not to alarm him. She framed it as his inconvenience, not her escape. She made the stop feel like something he was managing, not something she was engineering. Think carefully about what that requires. Think about the cognitive load of that performance. She had to read his emotional state continuously. She had to modulate her own voice, keeping the tremor out, keeping the volume controlled, keeping the desperation completely hidden. She had to construct a believable scenario and deliver it convincingly. She had to be patient. She could not act too early, at a red light with no people around. She could not act too late, if he made a turn towards somewhere isolated. She had to wait for the right environment, and she had to keep performing until that environment appeared. He pulled into a gas station. Gas stations are not random in survival escape research. They appear repeatedly in documented escape cases across decades, and there are structural reasons that explain why. Gas stations in populated areas are almost always operational around the clock. They have multiple access and exit points. They have extensive camera coverage. Fuel bays, entrances, parking areas, and surrounding perimeters are all typically recorded. They have customers rotating through continuously. They have workers stationed behind counters who have immediate access to phones and who are trained, in many cases, to recognize distress. And critically, gas stations are lit. Bright, consistent lighting that makes concealment nearly impossible. When a victim arrives at a gas station under duress, they arrive in one of the most surveilled, most populated, most structurally favorable escape environments that exists in everyday civilian infrastructure. This is not accidental. It is why law enforcement and survival researchers, when advising on abduction resistance, consistently identify public commercial spaces, and gas stations specifically, as high-value escape opportunities. The structural environment shifts the advantage. Outside that vehicle, in that space, she had witnesses, cameras, cover, and access to communication. She got out of the vehicle. The moment the car slowed, the moment it came to something approximating a stop, she opened the door and she ran. Not after thinking about it more, not after looking back. Movement, immediate, committed, directional movement toward people and toward the building. Survivor accounts in documented abduction escape cases describe a specific psychological moment that researchers have labeled the action commitment point. Before that point, the brain is still running probability calculations, still reading the offender's state, still monitoring the environment. After that point, once the internal calculation tips definitively toward action, the body executes. Hesitation at that point is dangerous. Survivors who describe successful escapes almost universally describe the action as instantaneous once the decision was made. She hit that point the moment the car slowed at the gas station. She ran toward people. She ran toward the entrance. She was loud and she was visible and she was impossible to ignore. The gas station attendant saw her. Customers saw her. Someone called 911. Dispatch received the call within minutes of her running through that entrance. Now here is what happened on the other side of that door, what the kidnapper faced the moment she got out. He was in a public space. Every camera at that gas station was recording. His vehicle's license plate was on camera. His face was on camera. His position relative to her was on camera. The entire sequence was being documented in real time. He had lost all control of the environment. The tools he had used to maintain control, isolation, movement, the enclosed space of the vehicle, were gone. His options had collapsed to two: pursue her into a public space full of cameras and witnesses and a 911 call already in progress, or leave. He left. That choice, which might read as simple luck for her, is documented behavior in predatory offender research. Offenders who rely on isolation and surprise as control mechanisms tend to disengage rapidly when public exposure eliminates those advantages. The research on predatory behavior patterns shows that witnesses and active surveillance are among the most effective real-time deterrents to continued criminal action. He ran because the structural environment of the gas station made continuation catastrophically high risk. The same environment that gave her a path out also eliminated his path forward. Law enforcement responded to the 911 call. She was coherent. She had maintained enough psychological clarity through the abduction, through the performance in the vehicle, through the escape, to provide actionable information. She described him. She described the vehicle. She described the direction he left. She gave law enforcement what they needed to build an active pursuit. That coherence is itself remarkable and documented. Research on victim testimony in trauma situations shows significant variance in the reliability and detail of accounts given immediately following a traumatic event. The stress hormones that flood the system during acute crisis, cortisol and adrenaline primarily, can both sharpen and distort memory and communication. Survivors who maintain problem-focused coping throughout the event tend to give more actionable, immediate testimony than survivors who entered frozen compliance or acute panic. Her cognitive strategy throughout the abduction wasn't just about escape. It was about maintaining the mental clarity that made her testimony useful the moment she was safe. The gas station's security camera system became the core of the evidence package. Security cameras at fuel stations are not simply there for deterrence or for catching fuel theft. In documented criminal investigations, gas station footage has provided license plate data, facial reference images that are admissible in court, vehicle descriptions with make, model, and color, and precise time-stamped records that establish unimpeachable chains of evidence. Prosecutors rely on this footage. In abduction cases involving children, where the victim's age makes them technically more vulnerable witnesses in some legal frameworks, the camera footage removes ambiguity. It recorded him behind the wheel. It recorded her running. It recorded his departure. The footage doesn't have trauma. The footage doesn't misremember. Detectives processed the footage quickly. Alerts went out. The vehicle description was matched. Law enforcement in active child abduction cases coordinate across agencies and jurisdictions at a speed that reflects the statistical importance of the time variable. Every hour after an abduction without location increases the risk to the victim. The alerts that went out after she ran into that gas station put every unit in the region on immediate notice. He was located. He was apprehended. The charging structure in cases involving the abduction of a minor reflects the severity that legislators have assigned to this specific crime. At the federal level, kidnapping under 18 U.S.C. Section 1201 carries penalties including life imprisonment when the victim is under the age of 18. State charges typically include kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and depending on additional documented conduct, a range of charges that stack in prosecution. Prosecutors in well-evidenced cases build stacked charges deliberately. Each charge is independently supportable, and the combined weight creates sentencing outcomes that reflect the totality of documented conduct. Her testimony, the 911 call recording, the gas station footage, the physical evidence recovered from the vehicle matched to the alert description. The case was built on documentation, not on any single witness or any single piece of evidence. Remove one, the case stands. That is what prosecutors call a resilient evidence package. He had no meaningful defense against it. He faced charges. He faced accountability. The documentation made sure of that. But here is the part of this story that matters beyond one case. Here is the systemic question this case demands. I spent years at the Tampa Bay Times and the Miami Herald covering cases where the system failed, where red flags were documented and ignored, where response came too late and outcomes were irreversible. I have read the FBI research. I have read the victimology studies. I have read the survivor testimonies. And one finding appears consistently across all of that documentation. Victims who escape from vehicle abductions, the specific high mortality scenario where a child has already been put in a vehicle by a stranger, share a behavioral profile that is not random. They assess, they communicate, they manage the offender's state, they identify the right moment, they act decisively when that moment arrives. These are not genetic traits. These are not gifts that some children have and others don't. These are behaviors, and behaviors can be taught. We tell children to scream, we tell them to fight, we tell them to bite and kick and make noise the moment something feels wrong. That instruction is correct for the prevention phase, for the moment before they're in the vehicle. It is correct and it is important, but it is incomplete, because sometimes, despite everything, a child ends up in that vehicle. And once they're in that vehicle, the strategy has to change. The FBI research shows that children who understand what to do inside the vehicle, who have been taught in age-appropriate terms that the goal is to get to public space, that gas stations and stores and crowds of people are safety targets, that their voice and their calm and their intelligence are tools, even when their body is not free. Those children have better documented survival outcomes. This is teachable material. Programs that teach it exist. They have been developed by child safety advocates, by former law enforcement, by psychologists who work with trauma survivors. These programs are not universally implemented in schools. They are not standard curriculum in most districts. They are not reaching every child who might at some point need them. That is the systemic failure this case makes visible. Not one offender, not one gap in law enforcement response. The failure is that survival information that exists, that is documented, that is demonstrably effective, is not being systematically delivered to every child as a matter of routine education. She knew something, and that knowledge saved her life. The question this case demands that we answer, as parents, as educators, as policymakers, as anyone who cares about this outcome, is why that knowledge is not universal. Why are we leaving children's survival probability to the lottery of whether their particular parent or school or program happened to cover this material before it became relevant? The documented research is there. The programs are there. The evidence that this works is there. What is missing is the institutional will to make it standard, to fund it, to mandate it, to treat survival knowledge as basic education rather than an optional supplement. She did everything right. She did things under conditions of extreme duress that most adults would struggle to perform under any conditions. She maintained clarity. She manufactured an opportunity. She executed at the right moment, and she came home. The system did not save her. She saved herself. With information, with calm, with a plan she built in real time from tools that someone had given her. That should not be extraordinary. That should be the baseline. If you have children in your life, the conversation this case demands is not complicated. You don't need to frighten them. You don't need to give them nightmares about strangers. You need to give them a framework. What public spaces offer, what the first minutes of an abduction mean, how to think under pressure instead of shutting down, how to use communication as a tool, how to identify the right moment, and how to move through it. That conversation is the most important thing this case has to teach. Not the charges filed, not the offender's history, not even the remarkable courage of one 14-year-old girl. The lesson is that courage without information is less effective than courage with it. And information is something we can give every child before they ever need it. She had it. She used it. She went home. He went to custody. The gas station cameras got everything. If the documented research and the real cases covered on this channel are what you're looking for, subscribe. Every week I bring the cases that have something concrete to teach. The cases where the documents reveal more than the headlines. Where the research explains what happened and why. Where the systemic picture becomes clear enough to do something about it. She survived because she kept her head clear. She survived because she had information. She survived because she found the right moment, and she took it. The least we can do, for her and for every child who might face what she faced, is make sure that information is not as rare as her escape made it look. I'm Danny Cruz. I'll see you in the next one.